Wonderful. Well, Dan, thank you for coming on. I'm really excited to get to know you a whole bunch better. I've listened to a couple of podcasts, but I haven't dove in. I don't really listen to podcasts. Is that a bad confession to make on a podcast?
I don't
I
really
don't
listen
know.
to a lot of faith podcasts. I listen to like movie
No.
podcasts and
Right.
politics and whatnot. Yeah,
I listen to a
you
couple of
gotta keep that
comedy
stream clear.
things or,
Yeah,
yeah, just,
comedy,
yeah.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't get too bogged down in your own world, you know?
Yeah, well, I feel like I do. Do you feel like you get caught up in the whole world of progressive Christianity, all this kind of stuff that's happening in this world? Like, or do you feel like you keep a good balance between the two, like your day to day life?
No, I definitely keep a balance. Yeah, I don't tend to spend a lot of my day sort of thinking about it. When I'm working on it, I'm working on it. But I'm in grad school right now, working on a doctorate in psychology. I still have my day job, which is for those watching the video. That's what these guitars and this keyboard and these drums are. My day job is writing advertising music until I get that degree and start practicing psychology. Um, and then I also have a 1 year old, just turned one, that I help care for, and working from home. So I don't have all day to sort of like.
I'm tired hearing this. Like, if anyone listens to this or watching this is going, gosh, I feel like I do nothing with my life. You're not alone. This is how I feel right now. Like,
Yeah,
do
it's
what
not.
I do and a full time job and
It adds
your
up.
grad
It
degree
adds up
and
to
you've got
about,
kids.
yeah. It adds up to about 40 hours a week, maybe 45 plus time, helping with the kid.
Right.
But yeah, but recently there has been this. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I feel like I've noticed a kind of a flaring up and an entrenchment of the culture war sides on this issue of progressive or deconstructing Christianity. It feels to me like the word deconstruction has reached enough critical mass that like traditional Christians are getting worried about it.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe, people in your average church have now heard of it, or some of them have, or something. And so you have these kind of personalities popping up like Elisa Childers, whose basically entire career, as currently anyway, not her career in Zoe Girl, her previous band, but like her current career is like, a bad way to put it would be fear mongering, and a kinder way to put it would be, being critiquing progressive
Sure.
Christianity and the deconstruction movement. And so I have felt actually some kind of internal pressure to step into that breach a little bit and be kind of a moderating force, if I can, like a peacemaking force, because I hate the culture war stuff, and I have so little appetite to be on either side. So that recently, the gravity of that has been pulling me in a way that is still meaningful and that I feel good about. But generally speaking, no, like I'm able to live my life for the most part, and that way the podcast is really fun. So the conversation or two that I have every week, the times that I've interviewed for other people's podcasts like this, these are like enjoyable times in my week.
Right.
So I've been able to keep it that way.
It still feels like a hobby almost, like, you're just doing something that you love. And yeah, I feel like that doing this full time. So I get it. I get talking to interesting people. I mean, I get stoked to have someone interesting on and talk to them for an hour and a half. That's a joy to me.
Yeah,
for sure. Wow. Yeah. I mean, gosh, there's so many things we could dive off of on that. But before we do you want to give like a little like synopsis of what it is that you do that, I mean, you've got a lot going on there, and we could talk about your grad stuff. I mean, we could talk about, music and whatever. But I guess the main bulk of people listening to this who know you will probably know you through your podcast. And I guess most people listening to this who would probably want to follow up with this will probably want to look through podcast, what you're doing with You Have Permission and things like that. Do you want to kind of explain what that is and kind of why you started that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so You Have Permission is my third podcast that I have either hosted or co-hosted. It's the only one I've got going right now. And it is really, it is the overlap of Christianity and sort of taking the modern world seriously. So that's basically science of all sorts, both hard science and soft science, social science, including, of course, psychology, which is, sort of my now chosen field of study and future career. But a lot of theology, a lot of, and a lot of sociology, a lot of looking at, trying to understand like what has happened in American evangelicalism in particular, because that's the world I come out of. And that more than half, at least, probably at least 60-70% of my listeners come from that world. And
Sure.
so we're often trying to understand that, but also understanding, just other trends among the type of people who listen to the show, or, whatever. I mean, Christian nationalism or racial issues or conspiracy theories or, all that stuff. And I'm personally really interested in religious and spiritual abuse. That's what I'm doing my own dissertation on. And so there have been a lot of episodes about that. For instance, the day we're taping this, yesterday's episode, if you have permission, was looking back at the Ravi Zacharias reports through the lens of religious abuse. So just specifically through that lens, if we're thinking about that literature and what we found, what do we see in that case, in his case? And so that's the kind of stuff I'm up to.
Wow. It sounds fascinating. I'm looking forward to this conversation for sure. So how did you get here? Like you talk about your tradition being through, like most of us in some way, shape or form, through a more conventional evangelical, maybe form of Christianity. How did you end up shifting out of that? What kind of sparked that change? Did you grow up? Were you kind of born into the Christian world and kind of navigate your way? I mean, what went wrong,
Yeah. Well, so I got off kind of easy, Phil. I was raised what I like to call kind of like moderate California evangelical.
Okay.
So, and that's not, of course, doesn't apply to all Californians, but there's a certain chill, there's a laxity to California culture. I'm from Northern California, not LA, but even so, it's more casual. My dad was a therapist. I didn't actually think that I would be following in his career shoes there. I didn't decide that till 35, but here I am. So he was a therapist. So he believed in science and mental health treatments and, all of that stuff. So it wasn't like I didn't have a fundamentalist upbringing at all.
Sure.
Although there were fundamentalists that were involved in my Christian schooling. And I actually found that I got a lot more damaging sort of teachings and experiences actually came through my school experience than my church experience. And certainly not really none with my parents. So, so that's kind of where it started. Nonetheless, even though I didn't have sort of, an all-encompassing worldview / culture / friend group, the way that some of my, Kentucky-born friends had, I didn't have all that to sort of tear down. I did still have sort of the traditional pitfalls of evangelicalism. So for me, the edges started fraying around questions of divine violence and violence in the Bible, questions of hell, eternal torment versus universal salvation, or at least annihilationism. Questions of course, eventually it gets to the biblical text, and that also related to evolution, LGBTQ questions. So that, it's kind of a pretty standard set there. I didn't have, one traumatic experience. I just kind of started thinking about these things and going, I studied philosophy in undergrad at a state school. So I didn't go into the Christian college world. And so, obviously you start coming up against these things pretty quickly. And I'm definitely not a philosopher. I don't consider myself one. Philosophy is very hard. I feel like it's above my pay grade. But I had one professor in college who was kind of a Catholic. I think he's Catholic now. I don't know if he would have identified as one then, but I knew that he had some sort of faith, and, the way he talks about things, and he was like very cards close to the chest and wouldn't really reveal too much. But one time in office hours, I was telling him about some of these struggles I was going through as a 18, 19-year-old. And I was like, sometimes I just sit here and I worry, like, will I still have faith if I follow these questions where they're going? And he said, you probably still will have it, but it will look a lot different than it does now. And that was a very good thing for me to hear. And that turns out to have basically been accurate. I do still have faith. It is a lot different than it looked then, especially intellectually different, but also experientially different, and all that stuff.
That's awesome. Did you go through that navigation? I presume in the midst of that, you were still part of a church community, still quite Christian. Did you have kind of a world, being in a secular university? I guess you also kind of were in this other world as well at the same time, I guess.
Right. Well, actually, it's kind of interesting because the school where I originally went to college, Cal Poly, it's in San Luis Obispo on the central coast of California, actually has a huge evangelical population.
Okay.
So it was an undergrad of about 17,000, and 1,000 of those people would go to Campus Crusade for Christ every
Wow.
week.
So there's still a big bubble to kind of immerse yourself in.
Yeah. The room I rented was in a house with non-Christians. In fact, drug dealers at multiple points.
Okay.
And I actually got along.
Do it like all the way.
Yes, exactly. I just thrown right in at 17. But I got along with those guys really well. And so I did have friends like that were not in that world, but most of my friends were Christians. I met them through that group. I got into a band called Sherwood that eventually became my full-time job for about 9 years. And so we would practice all the time, and we were all Christians. And so our friend group would congregate around the house that then we rented out, and the band and the shows and all that. So actually I never really was that cut off from Christian community.
Sure.
Although I did not find a church in college that I liked. I ended up actually just going to Catholic Mass. I don't know. You probably don't know much about this in the UK, but in California, a big deal you always learn about it in school is the missions. So these are like the early settlements set up by, Catholic missionaries and priests. Mm-hmm. And we had an old mission church in our town that had a 25-minute mass at noon on weekdays. And as a college student
right,
with a late schedule and some sort of ADD, that was perfect for me. And so that ended up being kind of my church experience during those days.
That's perfect. Well, I lived in California for 4 years, so
nice.
Further north than where you were, right up in Redding, so pretty north.
In Redding,
not the California experience. We're talking very different from most Californians. So
Redding's more that it's agricultural and
it's a different world. It's different world.
That's where we have Redding to thank for Bethel Church and all that
we do.
Has come.
Well, I was heavily
it.
involved with that. So yeah.
Oh, you were.
I was very, very involved with it. So
I don't know your story, so I mean, feel free to dive in.
I have a colorful, wild, diverse story, but this is the Dan Koch show. It's not the Phil Drysdale show today.
Well, I don't know how much you've told that on the air, right? But I'm curious.
I've told loads. There's nothing hidden at all there. But it's a wonderful part of the story, right? It all weaves in and becomes part of our who we become. But so I do know a little bit about transcend and include. There you go.
As I've heard people say that Richard Rohr says, quoting Ken Wilber.
Exactly. Every time.
But I've not read either of them saying that. I picked that. It's one of the things you pick up. It seems good though. I mean, therapeutically it's sound.
Is pretty wonderful. I love Wilber. I highly recommend his stuff.
I have people sort of recommending him to me pretty regularly, various listeners and friends and stuff. I haven't picked it up. I don't really read anything right now in the middle of school.
Dude, you've got a lot going on. And Wilber is not easy to read. We're doing, as part of my Patreon, we do a book club, and one of the things we're doing is one of his books. They begged me to do this book, and I'm like, you really want to do this book? Yeah. And I'm like, okay, so it's probably one of his most accessible books. And about actually, I think it was in the prologue, people were like, well, this is pretty heavy. And I'm like, yeah, welcome. And he's like, there's no footnotes in this one. It's a great book. If people want to start with Ken Wilber, I highly recommend Brief History of Everything. It's really good, but it's complex. You're creating a meta-narrative out of over 100 developmental models. I mean, what did you expect?
Yeah. I think I have avoided him in part because I'm very suspicious of meta-narratives. Like I'm a true postmodern as far as I understand the word in that sense. And so when spiral dynamics comes up and stuff, it's always like, well, the people who are talking about it always happen to be, green or above. They're like, they always happen to be at the top of the spiral. It's a little bit, it's not the same as chronological snobbery, but it's, I don't know, something gets me weird about it where I feel more comfortable just analyzing sort of the smaller bits and just trying to be honest about those. So, I'd prefer to let's do a personality profile of you and talk about your traits. And we
Sure.
don't have to get into any sort of like, well, the best combo of traits for the future man is,
Right.
like anytime it goes there, I just get a little, oh, I don't
Sure.
know about
I think
that.
most people
But
just misunderstand these models, and so
Mhm.
like it's just so it's a very basic way to see things as a hierarchy and as this is better. Even later stages are better than prior stages. Generally
Yeah.
speaking, if you're talking to someone that's at a later stage, you'll go, no, that's not how it works at all. Prior stages are much better than later stages in a certain context, and later stages are much better than an earlier stage in a certain context. And you are all of
Yeah.
those stages anyway. You're just applying them differently. You know, it's the
Sure.
a gunshot goes off in the air. It doesn't matter how green or yellow or however what high colors you are. You go down hard to your kind of more base instincts of like, I'm going to survive
Right.
this right now. I'm going to hide, or I'm going to try and tackle this guy to the ground. Those might be very basic primal instincts that are kind of more deeply within us that we might not like to be seen as every day, right? We don't want to be seen as a primal animal, but it's in us and it's not a bad thing, right? If you don't eat or drink every day, you go south really fast. So that's still in
Right.
you and it's still a core component of who you are.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the time these models are mistaken, that we try and think that a later model is better. You know, you look at hierarchy of needs or whatever your thoughts are on that. The base needs, they come up real quick when you neglect them. It doesn't matter how high up you go and how, you know, actualized you become it towards the top. If you stop getting paid, you're going to very quickly start worrying about getting food and shelter and water. And so, yeah, I think these things are, as always, nuanced, complex, and generally speaking, not to be glanced at and assumed that people know. And that's what happens 9 times out of 10. You know, like you said, almost everyone's like, oh, I'm at one of the latest levels, and that means I understand everything, and oh, I should definitely be in charge. And it's like, probably not. I don't think many societies are ready for someone at that level to be in charge. I think it would be a disaster. I mean, looking at who we've selected to be in charge so far, I think we're not ready for someone else.
Yeah, I may just not understand them well enough yet, and perhaps maybe one day I'll find that really appealing. Yeah.
Who knows? Who knows? Maybe as you move to different stages in the spiral.
Maybe. Yeah.
Who knows? Or if you were a different personality, who really knows?
Right. Sure.
I definitely think that's a part of it for sure. So I'm really intrigued as you were going through this. You know, you're living in this quite Christian bubble, and you're living in a Christian world, but you've got these questions, and you're talking to this professor and going, you know, I'm freaking out a little bit here. Mm-hmm. What was it as you started to feel a bit more freedom to expand in your thinking about this? Did you find room to be yourself in that, or was that quite a private, isolated process for you?
I think that having the band was really helpful, and the kind of small group of friends, maybe another 5 or so people. So call it a group of 10 sort of close friends and fellow musicians going through some of this together, you know, not always to the same sort of like theological level. Like I'm the only one of them that started a theology podcast, but in terms of like, you know, the critiques we had at the time of Campus Crusade that we were going to, and sort of like the weird feelings we shared. And some of those friends were like originally my appointed, you know, Bible study member or leaders in Campus Crusade. And so there was a lot of, it was not precious, you know, it was not a fundamentalist context where there's really any kind of top-down authority. And so I did feel like it was fine to be the guy who showed up 15 minutes late to skip all the worship songs, which is what I routinely did. And I felt that it was fine, you know, towards the end of our time there when we weren't even going anymore except to pass out flyers for our shows to the people that we knew would at least some of them would want to come, you know. And so that wasn't the kindest, I don't know, the way to use that resource, but it was fine. Like, you know, so I do feel like I've always had enough of a social structure, enough of what Mark Karras calls an unholy huddle, people with whom I can kick this stuff around. I've just always had that. And so it is actually hard for me to imagine what it is like for people who don't have that and who have to go through this stuff without that social group. And, you know, my wife as well, like she doesn't require the same level of, you know, intricacy and detail on a lot of these questions that your show and my show tackle. but we've broadly agreed. We've broadly moved the same direction at the same time. And so even there, to be able to, if something is bothering me, I can talk with her about it. And we've known each other and been dating or married for 15 years. So that's a long time too. So yeah, I've been really fortunate in that regard. And I had the right kind of band. We were that like Christians in a band.
Right.
And we weren't on a Christian label. We occasionally would play shows or tour with Christian bands. Like we toured with Reliant K once. But mostly we were not. And so it was just, I lucked out in a lot of that context. It's a great question though, by the way.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting because I think the vast majority of people that navigate this process, I don't actually have hard data on this, but I do know anecdotally, working with tens of thousands of people for the last 10 years, like I know quite strongly anecdotally, it's a very lonely process because most people do exist in these bubbles, and a lot of them, depending on how fundamentalist they can be, are not the safest place to explore, right? You start exploring some of these outreach. So you start going, oh, universal reconciliation, that's kind of an interesting concept. Or even annihilation, interesting. And you go, hey, Greg, have you ever read this book? And it's over, right? Greg talks to his mom, who talks to the pastor, and someone's knocking at your door, or you're getting a text, hey, would you like to have coffee, bud? Like, it's like, oh
the
God, what's happened?
Begins, right? Yeah.
It can get really scary really fast. And of course, that's not always the response. There's totally a whole breadth within the world of Christianity of how people reply. But it's a huge deal to have a community to kind of feel safe within to explore these things and to feel that I can be open and I've got at least 10 people that will go, oh, we don't care. We got your back.
I remember two stories about my parents here. So the first one is when I was still in high school and I was meeting with my, college counselor, the person whose job it was to help us apply to schools. And I was like, I'm thinking of studying psychology. I ended up applying at one school to psychology and at the school I went to in philosophy. So I ended up doing both. But she said, oh, I don't really believe in psychology. I only believe in biblical counseling. She had gone to this school called Point Loma Nazarene in San Diego, very conservative school, at least at the time. And I told my dad this. And my dad at this point had been, kind of a pillar of the community, regular therapist with his master's degree, for 20 years. And he talked to her or wrote her a letter or something. And she called me in and apologized. And she was like, I'm sorry, I didn't know what I was talking about. I was, just repeating something that had been spoon fed to me at school. And your dad actually convinced me that I was wrong. Wow. And so that kind of a thing, like small-mindedness in my family was usually like pushed back against in some way.
I would have loved to read that letter because that response is really interesting to me because absolutely I've seen people respond like that, but usually there's a way of communicating that might create that or facilitate that better, right? I can imagine.
Well, and I think she might
not have done that.
Right. Yeah. Right. She might have been on the rightward edge of the faculty there too. It's not like we had plenty of people applying in psychology. I don't think that I was the only person or anything like that. And I don't think all faculty would have shared her view at all. But the other one is like, I'm pretty sure I told my parents when I first read Rob Bell, Velvet Elvis, his first book. These are in my touring days. I don't know when it came out, but I read it around the time it came out. I read it in hardcover. So probably like 05, 06, something like that. And they didn't freak out or anything. I think my mom might've been like, oh, I don't know about a couple of these ideas, but like, I would be like, oh, Mom, we could talk about them if you want. Like, I just never had that in my nuclear family, in my family of origin. This was fine, And so, my dad had dropped out of college. He had a full ride to USC. He had a bunch of buddies killed in Vietnam. He was doing youth work and he dropped out. So when I dropped out to play in a band, it was like, we support you. You guys want to come live here? They bought a bigger house so we could live with them, which we never ended up moving in. And they kind of have given me some shit for that over the years. But I don't think I communicated it very well to them at the time. But so I really, this is actually, it's helping me realize this to be asked some of these questions because I don't get asked this stuff a lot. I had so much sort of support around this stuff. Even the podcasting, when I was, started being very public about some of these quite theologically liberal things, my mom has listened and she's been like, I don't agree with everything, but she's probably moved 60% toward where I'm at. And we'll talk about things sometimes, and So it's, yeah, I'm feeling very grateful for that as I answer this question and sort of verbally process it in real time.
Yeah, I mean that's huge. I mean, as someone that like spends 2, 3, 4 hours a day talking with people and helping them process how they're going to come out to family and what they're going through internally and figuring
Right.
out how to do this in the community. It's definitely the case that a lot of people have that kind of worlds that they're growing up in, and it's such a privilege for them. But and obviously because of the nature of what I'm doing, I'm skewed to talking to people that don't have that because they're
Right. Of
looking for
course.
someone to
Those are the
help them.
people who seek you out. Right.
But there's a lot of people that just don't have. I mean, there's they just can keep giving you a list of a whole nother group of people that will turn on them, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
being able to go right back to that central spot of like family. No, mom and dad believe in me, and they'll be there for me. No,
Yeah.
my wife's
Yeah.
walking with me either way.
Yeah.
No, I've got some buddies and some friends that are really here for me, even if they don't agree. That they love it. They love connecting with me, talking about these things. It's really really huge, and so yeah, I can well and truly see why that's set you up for a lot of success in being able to, because what it does is it affords you a certain privilege that you have a whole nother level of space mentally, emotionally, to be able to then spend time exploring this stuff and
100%.
explore it rather than terrifyingly kind of tiptoed into it, which
Right.
if you're thinking reading about this might be the most theological liberating thing I've ever done, but it also may end my relationship with my mom. Right? I mean, this is the two outcomes here.
That's a pretty
That's
tough
terrifying,
risk reward
right?
calculation. Yeah. Right.
Exactly, right?
Totally.
Um,
Yeah.
and so that's huge. That's exciting.
For me, it was really more
walk you
my
through
own anxiety that was the pushback
it.
force. So I have lifelong panic disorder. That's the DSM, name for it. But it's kind of like generalized anxiety, but it's more about sort of really concentrated panic now and again, and then the fear of such panic. Being
Right.
anxious about having a panic attack that's the defining difference between panic disorder and generalized anxiety. And so it wasn't for me, like I have needed even more and more of those instances to be
Mm,
able to fully admit to myself and to God that I have these liberal intuitions and beliefs. And so the two things that happened for me around the same time, this is more like 7 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, was I started trying contemplative practice. And people have varying, experiences with that. But my experience was like immediate and overwhelmingly peaceful and joyful.
wow.
And so that freed me up sort of internally. In the world of many of the modern forms of psychotherapy, we talk about what's called unconditional positive regard. This is Carl Rogers' notion that like one of the main things, and the data bears this out, that one of the main things that works about therapy is that the therapist treats the client just positive no matter what. They are like fully accepting. And then within that safety bubble, the client can work through stuff in a
Yeah.
way that they can't do with other people in their life who do not give them. Life's messy. People get mad at each other. They have wounds. It's hard to give someone unconditional positive regard. But
Right.
when you're being paid to do it, you can keep it up for an hour at a time. So that, like, I basically experienced that from God, or that's my understanding anyway, through these prayer practices. And that then freed me to go, oh, I don't have to like be anxious about, woe to the teachers, for they will be judged more harshly. Like, that's not what's going on here. And then
Right.
the second thing that happened was I became friends with a bunch of these theologically liberal theologians and philosophers and people who work, in that kind of world of grants and science and theology and all that stuff. And so those people, then I was like, oh, these people love God, and
Mm-hmm.
they like teach at seminaries and they teach liberal things. So the combination of those two things, of the direct experience of regard through prayer, and then the additional social support with people who actually teach these particular claims that I'm worried about. If I'm wrong and I lead other people astray, how will God judge me? Being like, oh, okay, like I can take a chill pill. to use 90s terminology here. And I was able to be confident enough to start, that's back when I started Reconstruct 5 years ago or so.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's a very, very huge thing to deal with that. I mean, one of the number one things people say as they start to deconstruct is like, what if I'm wrong? Right. I mean, because we have spent our lives, most of us growing up in this, decades for most of us, with a narrative going off in our heads, being repeated by pastors, by family, by friends, by us to other people, that if you stray off this path, you go to hell. If you are wrong, God will be disappointed in you or judge you, or you might get a Job experience where Satan, causes your car to crash because you masturbated the day before or whatever. I mean, who knows how you just become this paranoid wreck, right? And that's when you can be a paranoid wreck, Never mind, you start to go, okay, I'm not even sure there is a God anymore, but I'm kind of freaking out that there is. Yeah. And I mean, you'll know, looking at trauma and things like that, you can deal with people that are atheists and have been atheists for 2 decades and still occasionally wake up in cold sweats, fearing that they're going to go to hell. And that stuff is ingrained. That stuff is in the body, I mean, it's just stored up there and it needs to be, worked out. And usually more often than not, something like that, certainly in a kind of more somatic therapy or something like that. Rather than just kind of hoping over time it will disappear. I'd say 20 years on, it's probably not going to disappear in time. And that piece, I think this is what I find in general, like people ask, well, why is there such diversity in the deconstruction movement? Why is there so many people going, some end up progressive, some end atheists, some end up agnostic, some end up in the Church of Satan? I mean, it's just like, you name it, someone's probably going to go there. And I think often it can be as simple as they found the answers to their questions and they found a peace and a satisfaction and something that works for them in their life and helps them feel connected to themselves, their loved ones, the divine. There is no more kind of need to deconstruct for them. And maybe in time, 10 years later, something happens, a loved one dies, you get sick, whatever, or you read a certain Bible verse and it kind of kicks off again and you have some new questions that might move you along into something else. But I think, having something as painfully, debilitating as a panic disorder, and then finding something that brings freedom to that is an answer to sit on, right? You don't want to, so I'm going to keep moving away from this, right? No, right? I think I'll stick with this contemplative practice that's giving me peace and helping me feel connected and helping me feel, connected to the divine, centered in myself, peace. I mean, those are really good practices. And I think often people are going to get poo-pooed for not deconstructing enough because they stayed in Christianity or, and everyone and their mom has an opinion on what deconstruct and who should end up where. And it's usually that people should end up wherever I am, right? That's basically how that story, anyone that kind of has that opinion, it's amazing how it has to be that they end up where you are. Someone's ego taking over and being very fragile, I think, ultimately. But
well, so to be clear, it's not that the prayer practice did not sort of treat my panic disorder. My panic disorder has been treated through SSRIs and therapy and learning new, cognitive behavioral therapy and learning how to deal with it and recognize it and, casual conversations with my dad, who's a therapist, and so it was more though that like, I think that the panic disorder, and by the way, I describe it as in remission right now because I haven't had a panic attack in a long time, but it's still a very salient part of my life. And I sort of always know that it's there if I don't take care of myself to some level. Right. But it's more that provided the backdrop of anxiety around some of this stuff, I think.
Right.
And my experience with the contemplative practice is more just like, I experience what a lot of contemplatives and mystics write about. And I know that not everybody does experience that when they try these things. One of my best friends, theologian Sarah Lane Ritchie, who's over in Scotland right now working, who comes on my show all the time, she has not had these experiences and she's really tried. And we are roughly the same age, interested in the same stuff. We like a lot of the same theologians, and we just have had different experiences. And so that's, I think that that's also a way of looking at the question of, why do people end up in so many different so many different places? is that, they're the combination of people's dispositions and their brain wirings, a lot of which is random. Also, the type of people you end up surrounding yourself with that you feel comfortable around, that affects your plausibility structures. So the more people around you believe something, the more likely you are to believe it. How come very few deconstructing Christians end up as like Buddhists? A handful do, but probably because you don't have that many Buddhist friends. Not a lot of people are becoming Sufis, even though we all really like what the stuff we see from Sufi writers and stuff, but we're not hanging out with Muslims, so we're not going to become Sufi. So, a lot of it is like, we think that where we land is where all of the arguments have brought us. That's a part of it, but a lot of it is just that we land where we feel like we can have family. We land with people that we want to be like and want to be around. And so if you have had, like, I am quite comfortable landing in the progressive Christian space because a lot of the people that I really want to be like are progressive Christians. And I don't have any cognitive dissonance when I think about the type of lives that they end up living. I go, fuck yeah, that's the kind of life I want to have. So I guess, and then of course I find various arguments plausible and other ones implausible. And I, all that, of course, everybody does all that stuff too, dealing with the arguments. And I hone the specific brand of progressive Christianity that makes sense to me based on those arguments to the extent that I want to, or am willing to put the time in to think about it. But yeah, so that's another way of talking about how we're not all going to end up in the same place because we just don't have the same experiences. We don't have the same brains.
Yeah.
And the one thing I'll say is, I want to say, sorry, one last bit.
No, please.
One of my greatest convictions about the world that makes me a progressive Christian, as opposed to an Elisa Childers style, historic Christian or whatever, is that actually it appears to me that it's very hard to know true things in the world, especially the further you get from the straightforward and concrete or mathematical. So what is God like is a question that, like, I will never know that I've answered. Now I can have an answer and I can find it more or less plausible. It might be good enough for me to anchor my liturgical life. It might, whatever, but I'm never going to know that I know that I'm right.
Sure.
I'm never going to have that. So that's a big dividing line a lot of times in these conversations. And what I would never want to do is deconstruct out of a certainty obsessed evangelicalism to a certainty obsessed non-evangelicalism.
Sure.
That's a lateral move at best.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I fully agree. I mean, it's why when we did our research in highlighting what is a deconstructing Christian, you can't research a group unless you can define it. And that was the hardest part of everything we've done, was just going, wait, how do you define this group? Because it's not that they have a set belief, it's that they have a commonality in their trajectory away from something, really, more than anything else. Right. And so it's really hard to kind of put your finger on it. But one of the key components was that they hold their spirituality, whatever that might be, with less certainty than they held their fundamental belief. And so it's fascinating. One of the things that you touched on there, though, that I think is so interesting, because I 100% agree that, of course, we're shaped by our community and the structures we're around, and what makes us feel comfortable and safe and fit in and be able to exist in this world as a person in relationship with others. What makes that so interesting is, as you say, you're more likely to land up as a progressive Christian, because coming out of Christianity, at least it's more likely you'll find some progressive Christians that kind of get where you're coming from, where you've been, where you are right now, how you see the world. It's all going to slowly come together a lot easier than if you jumped into a Buddhist commune in, China. Right. That's less likely. What fascinates me the most, though, is that dynamic clearly isn't strong enough to stop people deconstructing. Because if that was the most strong drive in life, people just wouldn't do it. But what it shows is, as strong as that drive is, as strong as that is to help shape us and guide us and direct us, deconstruction is a powerful force. These questions are so powerful that they cause us to go, I'm going to get up and, use a biblical analogy like Abraham, get up and leave my father's faith, leave everyone I know, leave my community, leave my, it's this powerful shift. That on a psychological level is really quite intriguing. because it is a
Yeah.
huge ego death on a lot of levels. You're really you're dying to a lot of things in that step.
So I think that what I'm realizing about myself is that I'm a realist about deconstruction. I think in the way that it's maybe not the right way to use the term, but in the way that people who talk about science or truth or whatever, there is a fact of the matter, and maybe like a critical realist approach to epistemology, to literature, to historical criticism is like there is a fact, but there is a fact of the matter, but it's difficult to get at it, and so we're going to utilize all these methods to sort of do our best to get at it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not as if all truth is constructed in the minds of the beholders, right? So if we apply a realist framework to deconstruction, I think what we find, and this is early for me, but I think that it's borne out by what I've seen, is that the more of a house of cards you have built up around this doctrine, this community, this way of life, the more totalizing it is, the more disconnected from the facts it is, the bigger the fall and the more inevitable the deconstruction is once one of those things is pulled at, right? So one thing that you and I don't end up finding a lot of is people coming to us and being like, Phil, Dan, oh my God, I'm so glad I found your podcast. So I was raised moderate Episcopal. Yeah, or I was raised Unitarian Universalist. I don't get those emails because there is less pain in that. There is the Unitarian minister is like afraid to claim anything is true, much less that you can base not only your entire life, but all the global events of the next 20 years on this reading of this obscure passage, right? Like, so there is a sense in which the more divorced from reality it is, and I'll give you one example of divorce from reality. And this is really what a lot of my early episodes of my show were based on, was just there does exist a variety, objectively speaking. I feel like I was yelling that from the rooftops at the beginning. Like, so if your pastor says Christians believe X, and then X is some Southern Baptist interpretation of these 3 verses from different books put together, that is false. It's false that Christians believe it. What's true is that certain kinds of Southern Baptists and other Calvinists believe this interpretation of these things. So the more distance you get between the claim and the facts, as opposed to a Methodist preacher saying, we love John Wesley, and Wesley thought that this verse indicated X. Well, that's just not going to be a problem if someone comes across the Calvin interpretation of that verse, because they know, oh, we're going on Wesley, you know? And so I'm picking on Baptists here, but you see it elsewhere as well, of course.
Sure.
So there's a realist dimension to this, I think. And that is explains some of the variance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you believe things are absolutely this way, no question, this is the way it is, and one thing is proven wrong. You see this a lot. I mean, it's a trope and a stereotype, but kids brought up in a homeschool, in church all the time, never really exposed, and they taught that God created the world in this many days and blah blah blah, and they go to a secular university and they take a geology class, and they go, holy shit.
Yeah,
everything is a lie, and it's like, well, no, hold on, probably not everything. No one is smart enough to lie about everything, right? No one's that smart. No one can be that smart enough to be wrong about everything. They might have got some stuff right accidentally, but they probably got some stuff right somewhere. But the extremity of like, well, I was told that if you can't believe X, then it's all crap. Yes, if that's not true, because this is just absolute black and white, this is what it says, and therefore if what it says is wrong, then all of it is wrong. And you get to bits where you go, oh, well, what about when they give the dimensions of the arc and they explain how to make a circle and they give pi to be 3? Well, it's not right. It's bloody good for the Bronze Age. It's really pretty close, right? But we know that pi is not 3. So are we going to throw the whole Bible out, or are we going to go, this probably isn't a mathematical text? Maybe we should give Genesis a bit of grace, right? It's just like these kind of points of like, we look at, the first couple of chapters of Genesis and go, this is ancient mythological poetry. It probably isn't a biological book. It probably isn't a geological book. It's not a book explaining, kind of like, astrological physics and, and yet if you're raised believing that stuff, you have to throw it all out at once. And so I think you're spot on. Like, most people that go through this process are coming out of something extreme, and their reaction, fairly, at least early on, can be very extreme. It's quite a pendulum swing of, and it's a pendulum swing of emotion that comes with that as well, right? Because it's not a small kind of push out of a certain belief.
It's escaping, to the extent that it's what you're describing, it's very similar to leaving a cult. I mean, it's like, complete sort of thought and community control. And to the extent that it is like that, then that literature becomes applicable. And the stuff we see there is fascinating. And I am glued to all these great cult shows that have been coming out recently. It's
absolutely.
But it's also interesting, like there is a moderating influence on that. So you could even have a church that specifically teaches all of those things, but you might still have a bunch of families in that church where one parent or the other parent's like, yeah, but maybe dinosaurs were 1 million years ago. You can have people that don't buy it all that come to church twice a week.
Right.
And that just think like, that's not why I'm here. Yeah, that's what the pastor believes. Mm-hmm. And if that's your mom, then you're better set up than if your mom is like, Pastor, how can I convince my children that you're right about this? How do I fight the dark forces of secular science? And so much of that is affected by what our primary caregivers and our primary sort of social group are like.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the more restrictive, the more you are going to boomerang out, and the more pain you're going to have as you do. Right.
That's so interesting. I can see that in my own journey. Just looking, I'm a pastor's kid, and my dad was quite, he just came from a very rough and quite wild background. He was in the Navy. He was a DJ. He was like, quite wild, womanist, like all sorts of just crazy drugs. And then got saved, miraculously healed at a Pentecostal meeting, and was like, oh, I guess I should get saved since I got healed of a stomach ulcer overnight, and then became a pastor and was very, very serious about his faith, very intense. But my mom was very serious about her faith, but totally disagreed with them on, a whole bunch of stuff. In the grand scheme of things, probably like 10% or something, right? But not a huge amount. But she always brought us up to question everything. And we saw that modeled when my dad would say something, and she'd be like, well, kids, I don't know if I see it that way, but maybe it's a bit more like this. And you're like, oh, okay. And it's like what you're saying, right? Yes. If you're brought up and going, look, the Methodists, us Methodists, there's this guy called John Wesley, and he kind of helps us, informs us on what we think. But what happens is if you go at some point, you go, well, Wesley's obviously wrong on that. Well, because you've been taught this is Wesley's interpretation, you can go, well, what were some other people's interpretation? Now I can hold on to 98% of what Wesley's convictions were and look at some other ideas in that area. And that's such a freedom. I wonder, was it intentional of you to focus on that so much early on? Was there this, because I see that as people come out of these extreme positions, I never try and dictate where people go. I just think on the whole that can be quite, in my opinion,
it doesn't work anyway.
But yeah, exactly. It only adds stress to me, and it becomes a bit of a question on the ethics.
For sure.
But I do find that giving people as many options early on helps them feel safe in this process, where they don't just go, oh my gosh, I've been thrown out, catapulted out of Christianity into atheism, which I mean, atheism is worse than Satanism in the church in America for a lot of people. This is the worst outcome. And so just to go, hey, by the way, on your way into that deep evil atheism, here's a whole bunch of other ideas about that question of hell you have. Here's a whole bunch of ideas of how some people have incorporated evolution into their Christian faith. Here's some ideas about that. Was that intentional on your part to kind of frame the beginning of your podcast and what you were doing?
It was intentional. And more recently, I don't know if you saw it, but my friend Sari and I, we co-authored a website that's up called soyourdeconstructing.com. And it basically is the thing you just described. It's a list of resources on all these potential questions that gives a variety of views. And I think it was intentional. And it continues to be intentional. I just covered a lot of the big questions already in 100 some episodes. But the reason that I was intentional about it is it's just fucking obvious. Like, it's just in terms of like a market sense, it was the clearest niche. Like, it's the simplest argument you can make, is to say, look, pick whatever book by whatever scholar you trust on the history of Christianity, okay? Whoever you like. And then let's just look at the way that Christians have disagreed on this.
Yeah.
It's just the facts. It's completely inarguable. You can either ignore it, or you can just yell and tell yourself that your little branch happened to get it all right. Even if you're a Catholic, which is like 60% or so, 55, whatever, of worldwide Christians, you still know that Orthodox Christians exist and that Protestants exist.
Right.
And you know that they've written books that maybe someone in your life has read, or maybe you like Terrence Malick films. Actually, I think he might be Catholic. Whatever. Like, there is something that a Protestant or an Orthodox person has made that you resonate with.
Right.
And so that to me is just like, it's not only step one, it's like the most obvious step one. And it is insane to me how common it is for people to skip over that. Not people who are deconstructing, people in these more conservative to just ignore that. It's just, it's bonkers. Like, you could say we disagree with them, or I think this guy's heretical or whatever. Okay, fine. That's a better place to start, at least, that you're acknowledging that they exist. And then we can talk about, well, what are the arguments, Yeah. Anyway.
What do you think that's, so I would immediately jump to some sort of developmental model and say, well, you've got conventional and post-conventional becomes more rational and wants to look at lots of views and doesn't have a particular authority figure that's giving them their meaning and safety. That's how I immediately look at it and go, oh, of course, these people they don't feel safe with the idea of multiple ways to see this, because in their way of seeing the world, there has to be an absolute one way, and they need to know that one way or they're fucked, right? They're going to hell.
Right.
So whereas once you kind of move beyond that, you can go, oh, actually, I feel a lot more safety knowing there's multiple views and using my own autonomy and individual intellect and rationality to reason what might be the most reasonable answer. But do you think there's more going on there? Like, because it's not, like you said, this is so obvious to someone once you're outside that. But I remember being in it, and I was always a bit of an anomaly. I've always been a bit anomaly. I remember my first week at Reading in California with Bethel. They gave me a book. I went to do the school there, and they were like, here's Bill Johnson's book. This is the reading for the first month. And I'm like, isn't he teaching like every day? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, so this is the reading by the guy that teaches us every day. I'm like, is there any diversity in this curriculum? And I get it. Like, you're here to learn about their stuff. So I picked up John Piper's God is the Gospel and Brian McLaren's A Generous Orthodoxy and read those 3 books in the first couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And that's my default, right? So I speak about this, and I don't know at what point I was like that, but I'm sure I was like that, but I can't remember. I've always been a bit like, well, there's probably different views to learn from. But for the most conventional Christians, they're not looking at different views. The different views terrify them, right? The most you'll hear about a different view is from your pastor, Mark Driscoll, screaming about how the shack is dangerous, or that's about as exposed to the shack as you're going to get.
My guess is, I would guess, though, that most people don't spend their time looking at different views more out of a lack of appetite than fear. I'll give you an example. There was a brief stint in my life when I was driving elderly people to doctor's appointments. This is before I was in school. I had a little extra time, and I was feeling guilty for not volunteering to do anything. And I brought my wife with me one day. We did some errands after this thing or whatever. And there was this wonderful, in many ways, so wonderful. She invited us back up to hang out at her place when we brought her home. She was a Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox woman. And we got to talking about faith somehow. And right before we dropped her off at the medical clinic, she was talking about how Orthodoxy is the true Christian faith. And I said, well, I have a hard time really believing that, because, there's all these other, like, what about Mother Teresa? And she's like, oh, she's one of us. So, right. Now, the point is just, this woman, she had a way around it. She wasn't actually committed to the strict interpretation of that claim. Right? Like, she had a way in for people that she thought exhibited Christ-like behavior.
Right.
I think that's more what most people are like. I don't think most people actually have the gates that strong. I think they just don't have the time or the inclination, and they've got a way around it anyway, if you really push them on it. Most people will say, even if they don't think Catholics are Christians, that Mother Teresa is a Christian. So I don't know. Yes, but I'm wary of ascribing so much to fear. I do think fear is a part of it. And the more fundamentalist and the more controlled you get in a societal sense, the more you'll see fear. But then the other really big and possibly more determinative aspect, I don't have any way of proving that, is the personality type itself. And so how afraid of change is someone? How risk averse are they? Stuff like that. Those are kind of like personality traits that we can map and get sort of numbers on. And those would also correlate to that kind of fear.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts.
No, it's interesting. I am somewhere on the spectrum, and I'm very averse to change, like massively. Which
on the autism spectrum.
Yeah. So I find this is one of the most hilarious ironies. Is that like I have like done nothing but change my belief constantly as I've grown up, which is a terrifying thing to change. As far as
so it's been hard for you.
But it hasn't. I've enjoyed it so much, and I think
are other types of change hard and not belief change, or
trust me, my wife can't get me to eat a different meal. You know what I mean? Like I do not like things being different, which is so I've always found that is quite ironic. But I do think it highlights that this isn't just about avoiding change or fear, or I do think there's more going on here, and I think actually the pursuit of truth is often just as strong a motivator, or even external pressure from suffering, or even the pressure of love. You find out your son's gay, and suddenly that pressure is enough for me to start questioning: do gay people really go to hell? Because I really don't see that. My son loves Jesus, and I'm sure Jesus loves my son. So there's these different motivators that are as strong, if not stronger at times, for sure. It's so interesting.
I'm not the biggest Richard Rohr guy. I like him fine. That's a weird thing to say about someone like Richard Rohr. I like him fine, but I have found some of his stuff helpful. But I do think he's right when he says that most people don't. I think this was Rohr. It could have been McLaren in an interview with somebody else. I feel like they look similar in my head, and I get them mixed up, like their faces. I don't even know if they do. Anyway. One of them said, I think Rohr, that people don't really change that often. Usually the way they change is great love or great suffering. Yeah. And I think that that's true. Yeah. And so that instance of your kid coming out as gay is actually a combination of both. It's great love for your kid and great suffering given your thing, that your position that you're in, your community, whatever. Yeah. And that forces, a look at things. To your autism thing, I interviewed a young autistic theologian named Erin Burnett recently. She's actually Irish. And she has been doing research on autistic Christians and is going to keep going with it. But she's already found that autistic Christians with autism are more likely to want something to sort of check out rationally. And so there is maybe a resistance to change in terms of habits and behaviors, there might be an additional countervailing force of like, this shit has to make sense. Yeah, I can't have internal inconsistencies here. That's not going to work for me. That is higher, perhaps. So I don't know anything about that. I haven't done any of that research.
That for me feels true, and that's how I've probably most of the time. That's kind of like it probably just feels like this deep seek for like, this needs to make sense. It needs to line up. It needs to be true. But I know that, I speak to plenty of people that come to me and they're just going, I need to know what's true. But of course, what's funny is they find maybe some more answers, but they tend to find less and less certainty as they go on, right? As you study,
that's
right?
The truth, because that's the
there's 20 ideas here.
Right. Because
we're trying to define the indefinable and the ineffable, right?
Yes, exactly. You're coming up against reality in that sense, I think, in a very good way, in that reality is not easily definable. Science, especially social science, right, when you're not dealing with chemical levels and you're trying to measure, we were talking beforehand, we were shooting the shit a little bit about research methodology and how difficult it is to measure well-being. Well, there's a reason it's difficult to measure well-being. It's difficult to know things. It's difficult to measure anything. It takes a lot of work by a lot of really smart people bouncing their ideas off of each other to just even figure out how to measure happiness, and even then there are 10 competing ideas. Yeah. And so that's the way the world actually is. And if our religious systems are hell-bent on denying that that's what the world is like, then they will lose people that come up into contact with the way the world really is. That's
Yeah.
kind of the House of Cards thing that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, I mean it's huge, right? If you look at it as, this kind of, there's a shift away from this kind of conventional approach to a very rational approach, and that loves to kind of knock it all down. But like you're saying, you start to move into kind of a more postmodern kind of understanding, and you go, well, hold on, happiness? Well, your happiness is based on your life and your full spectrum of all that emotion you felt between happiness and sadness, whatever the spectrum is. And so your most happy moment could be a 10 out of 10 for you. But that 10 out of 10 might be a 4 for someone that had a much happier life. And then what does that mean? What made them happy makes makes me happy differently, right?
Yeah.
If I'm like obsessed with, different things and I don't like change, having the same meal every day makes me happy. That might make someone else miserable, right?
Right.
And so it's such a complex thing to even begin to look at, like talking about, we talked at the beginning, but I think it's an interesting concept, is like, because people ask me this a lot, like, I feel miserable leaving the church. Like, will that change? Like, why is that? And I go, well, go look at the data, right? This has been studied a lot. When people leave religion, their wellness goes down. It does.
Yeah.
There's not really an argument about that. But the problem is that wasn't some objective person, outside of time and space, looking at this little object and going, this is their wellness right now, and look at it now. That's someone saying, well, this is how I retrospectively evaluated my wellness before, and this is how I evaluate my wellness now. Or even, these are the parameters I have for wellness. Before, I didn't even understand mental health. Right? Think if you're maybe quite extreme career advisor, they might not even believe in mental health issues,
Right.
What's your wellness? Well, I'm full of joy all the time. I'm full of the spirit of joy. Maybe an extreme
but there
example,
are some, but it's
complex.
not all just, it is complex. And some of those self-report measures are really difficult. Like, okay, so for instance, and I'll agree with you before I disagree with you. So the agree with you part is, I just shut down my big survey, looking at the prevalence of various kinds of potentially abusive religious and spiritual situations, as well as internal feelings as a result of those negative experiences. One of the questions I asked was, how theologically conservative or liberal are you? And I can compare, the people who are the most conservative and the people who are the most liberal, and I can look for differences. And what I find is that people who are more liberal report way more, massively, significantly more spiritual abuse than people who are more conservative. But some of these items should not have a difference, right? These are like concrete items, like my pastor explicitly claiming to speak on God's behalf. That should not change between, the group being more conservative or more liberal, but it does, because of people might not even catch that that's what's going on, right? Or maybe they think, well, this sounds like a liberal survey, and so my pastor has kind of spoken kind of like that, but I don't think that's what he meant, so I'll put never. Like, I don't know. There are all kinds of reasons that people can do that. So that's me agreeing with you. But on the other hand, there are more objective things, like not all these studies are comparing people from when they were conservative to then later when they're liberal. So that one of the confounding variables there is time, or it's called history. So maybe something happened in their life. They got more education around these terms. So we can't actually trust their two reports. That's why you do do studies where you, at the same time, you ask people in both camps. There is divorce rates. There is, marital satisfaction rate, which is not the kind of thing you would quite assume, there are other things too that are more unimpeachable than some of the, self-report measures.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are questions like, how many times have you been stressed in the last 24 hours? There are things like that smart researchers are doing their best to kind of get around these problems. Right. And so it's true that it's complicated, but it's also true that, like, if you're going through faith deconstruction and you are losing the primary source of meaning that you've had for your entire life, you're going to go through some fucking pain. It's going to be hard. It will be kind of like a divorce, some version of that, and you should expect that. And there is also life on the other side of that. Yeah. That's also true.
Yeah. No, it's interesting looking at longer term studies, you do see a bit of a bell curve, You see this huge drop and then it kind of comes back up.
Yes, that makes sense.
And that makes sense for sure. And especially because when you look at it, the grief that goes on, it's loss of relationship to God. It's loss of meaning, or it's certainly, even if you hold on to your faith in God, your relationship changes. It's loss of what you had.
Like my professor
loss
said.
of your own identity. It's loss of your community. It's loss of every component of who you are is intricately woven into this. It's so much loss. And what's
the more fundamentalist you are, the more everything is. And this is another thing that's interesting. So what's interesting here is you might be tempted to say that since the literature shows that greater religiosity is correlated with greater well-being, you might be tempted to say, well, then maybe these hyper-religious fundamentalist communities are like really good for people. But I think that that's a leap that's not substantiated, because the group of people who are religious includes all the people I just talked with you about, like the Orthodox woman who nonetheless believed that Mother Teresa was one of them, right? Like that includes all the moms like your mom who attend the whatever church and consider themselves religious, but they don't buy into the crazier interpretations, and they don't. So the whole pool of religious people, it includes all these moderates. And the moderates are not the people who write the books and write the homeschool curricula, right? That's not the moderates doing that. And so if I've ever thought like, and I have sometimes worried, like, well, am I like encouraging people out of these healthy communities? It's like, well, the people who most need your show or my show are not the moderates, right? They are the ones who got in at the dangerous end of the curve, right? They are 1 or 2 standard deviations from the mean, if you want to use that language. And they're the ones who are really at risk. And in fact, those people are probably in many ways dragging down some of those scores, from the more integrated, moderate, healthy, in my language, in my view, healthy religious people.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mention that, because, you look at data on pastors and church leaders, and the wellness metrics are not good, right? They are really, really negative most of the time.
I haven't seen this.
It's astonishing stuff. I mean, if you look at data on pastors, it's terrifying. 70% report feeling anxiety, like, basically 24/7. 1 in 10 pastors retire as a pastor. Isn't that astonishing?
Wow.
9 out of 10 pastors don't, quote unquote, make it, whatever that means. I don't know. They die. Maybe they just keep working after they should have retired. I mean, that's probably a metric as well somewhere. I'm assuming that's covered in some way. But there's astonishing data out there that shows pastors are not happy. They're not comfortable. They're overworked. They're whatever. So there's lots of different metrics within the church. There's so much. Especially you've got the moderates. You've got the people that are, running everything to the ground or for the best possible outcome for a lot of people, depending on who they are. And it's such a complex world when we start looking at this. So tell me about your study that you're doing. Can you talk about what your doctorate's about and what you're looking at?
Yeah, I can now. I couldn't for a few weeks there because I didn't want to
you don't want to mess with
my thumb on the scale about who takes the survey, right? So what it turns out I was actually measuring was just a massive battery of prompts around spiritual and religious abuse. I'll read a few. So had 2 main sections. One was external events, being asked to give up personal, vocational, or educational goals by a pastor, seeing scripture used to justify physical punishment or other types of severe discipline, threatening divine punishment to keep group members in line, being treated as less than because of my skin color, gender, orientation. So all of these are just people just answer never, once or twice, sometimes, often, all the time. And then the second group is more internal type states. Where is this? This report's being weird. Okay, so how often have you experienced these as a result of your negative religious experiences? Anger upon reflecting on these experiences, distrust of God, lack of self-worth, self-hatred or self-loathing, avoiding religious activities to reduce distressing feelings, stuff like that. So it was like 68 of those prompts or so, and then a bunch of demographic questions, basically. And so I am trying to get some good prevalence data. Basically, we really don't know how common spiritual abuse is. And by the way, spiritual abuse and religious abuse are terms I use interchangeably because there is no agreed upon definition in
Yeah.
Some people prefer either term. So I'm just using that as either one. And so we don't really know. Like Lisa Oakley did one study in the UK of 500 and something church-going UK Christians, and that's literally it in the Western world. So this is the next one, and it's 3,200, English-speaking Christians, mostly in the U.S., but not entirely. And I still have a lot of analysis to do on how that should be weighted, if it should be weighted at all, and all the boring stuff that we can save people. But yeah, that's what it's looking at. And then eventually I plan to develop a scale, a shorter scale, 30 items or less, that a clinician could administer to a client if this is something that's come up, and they can in 5 minutes get a score or two spit out that's compared to some norms, and they can go, oh, okay, interesting. And you said that this one happened all the time. Let's talk about that, So that's eventually the goal. But I'm also just really interested in the prevalence stuff as well, which is on the way to the scale.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, I don't know if you even know the kind of weighting of what countries are represented and stuff, because obviously I'm assuming you're pulling from your audience, which is largely English speaking, which is crossing. But you look at that, and you look at Lisa's work in the UK. The UK church is going to be radically different than the US church.
It doesn't appear to be radically different.
It is
so far.
Okay.
I mean, so far it's not radically different on a number of the specific items. So I included a bunch of the prompts from Lisa and Rachel's survey so that I could test this out. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, and the numbers I did have were not final, but I actually found that mostly they were within 5-8 percentage points of each other.
Awesome. That's really interesting.
And part of the problem there is that I included a once or twice item, and I don't think that they did. I think theirs was just never, sometimes, often, all the time. And I threw in a once or twice for methodological reasons.
Right.
But so especially if you kind of balance that out, it looks to be kind of similar. And that's if that's the case, that's really interesting.
That's hugely interesting.
Then we have basically multiple attestation that this stuff happens about this often. It's, some of the numbers from her study, something like 84% of UK Christians in a previous church at some time did not feel, or at least sometimes did not feel comfortable raising concerns or questions. 84%. And it was 71%, I think, in their current church. Don't quote me on that. But those kind of numbers are like, okay, so that's really meaningful. That goes to a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We had in one of our initial surveys, we had almost identical questioning. We used slightly different ones.
Okay, we're gonna have to share data here very soon.
I know. Yeah, exactly. I love data as well. My friend that's in research, we're frequently sending each other the behind the scenes stuff and just geeking out. So it's so much fun to look at these kind of things, and it's exciting when you can find a study and go, oh, here's a study done in the UK. If I can kind of overlap some of the questions here, we can start to see, how similar this is. The things that come about are so fascinating. So in our first study, there was this is going into the territory of geekiness, guys. I'm sorry, but we did so there's a metric called the revised faith development scale, and so this is a scale based on a whole host of different things. It's been developed over about 30 years, but it kind of initially emerged out of some different developments theories based on spirituality and faith. And then I think James Fowler got involved and that tweaked it a bit, and then some other people got involved. That's what I was wondering, if
it was that stages
it kind of continued to grow.
Yeah.
It influenced it at one point, but I think as it kept getting revised, I think it's like third or fourth iteration over 30 years. Yeah. And so it's kind of evolved and stuff. But what's interesting is if you give that, it's a scale from 16 to 64, and if you give it to a conventional Christian across the board, almost any denomination, the score is about 42 as kind of the mean, and we give it to a whole bunch of deconstructing Christians. And what's fascinating is it was a solid kind of 13-point jump. It was a huge jump, and we had a control group of I think we grabbed about 56 conventional Christians that were at random, and it's amazing actually, because their mean was exactly 42, and I was like, I guess that is fairly accurate then, I guess.
Good control group.
So you have these moments where you can go, ooh, something's going on here. It's really interesting. So I love that, you can compare something like the US to the UK and go, ooh, that's a commonality. That's crazy considering how different. I mean, the UK is a largely atheist society. The church is likely to look somewhat different than the church in America. I can vouch for that, having lived in both and having traveled to probably about 1,000 churches across the two. I can tell you they're quite different at times. They're very similar in other ways. And so suddenly you go, oh, one of the similarities is that they don't feel comfortable sharing. Interesting. That's a really interesting kind of commonality to run through Christianity, or
and then
at
if
least
you
conventional
find
forms of it.
You may find that some of these things are kind of baked into the structure of church itself.
Yeah.
The more, sort of cultures, if you were to find similar answers and whatnot. So yeah, that's all. That stuff is great. I'm very excited to be at the very beginning of my research career. This is, literally my first thing in that, but I think I'll be researching part-time indefinitely because I love it.
It's so much fun. And especially once you've started to develop an audience and you've got like an incredible pool of data. I mean, most researchers start drooling at the idea of having 3,200 people submitting a survey, right?
It's incredible.
That's
it's
insane.
Incredible.
And so
I pulled out all the favors, and I had a lot of other friends and podcasters help me. But I think it was mostly through my own show and my Facebook friends and just, asking 30 or 40 people to spread the word. And then it kind of just kept people just kept sharing it with each other. Awesome. There was a lot of snowball sampling. And so I'm glad that I asked that, how conservative do you consider yourself question? And I'm glad that I asked, there's a question from the General Social Survey, which is an American, like, big representative survey that gets asked every year or something. And there are good numbers there. There's a question about the Bible. It's like, is the Bible, should it be taken word for word literally? Is it inspired but not word for word? Or is it a man-written book of fables and moral teachings? And so I asked that question exactly the same way. So one option I have is to weight my responses by the standard American answers to that question. And so I can give those conservative voices more weight and basically offset my, the convenient sampling of being a progressive Christian podcaster, right? So I can at least go, well, this is, I don't have like a lot of Catholics and I don't have a lot of people of color, but this is at least getting close to the religious views of the average American Christian. And so that will give me closer to a representative sample. So there's stuff like that. That's really interesting too. And all the numbers come down when I weight by that. There are fewer people that report any number of the issues. Like I'm looking just right here at the first question about the pastor explicitly claiming to speak on God's behalf, and the number of people who say never in the regular sample is 35%, but in the weighted sample is 42%. So it's about a 6.5% jump there. But still, that means that even waiting for giving the conservative voices more, that basically
that's a lot of people.
Almost half of American Christians, at least sometimes, often, or all the time, their pastor claimed to speak, explicitly claimed to speak on God's behalf. That's not Orthodox Christian doctrine.
No, that's
no.
Depending who you ask.
No Christian denomination believes that individual pastors directly speak for God. Nobody believes that. So what's going on there? It's some kind of narcissism. It's some kind of getting carried away with your little power that you have. I don't know.
Yeah.
But some of
narcissism studies within leadership as a whole, and then if you subset that into pastoring, they jump even more. But I mean, those are fascinating in and of themselves. Whether they attract that or whether like this is a systemic thing that kind of facilitates that growing within someone to become more narcissistic. Who knows? But it's one of those things you can point to and go, "This is here. We're not sure why. Leave it with us. We'll keep looking." But it is concerning, like whatever it is, and it's probably a bit of both, that narcissists would love to be in that position of power, and that there is stuff about the system that church has become, this institutional movement thing, and maybe even some of the theological structuring around Christianity as it has become for most people facilitates narcissists. It facilitates abuse. It facilitates sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, potentially. I mean, you just look at the Ravi Zacharias stuff that you just did a podcast on. It's not hard to go, oh, I can see how certain theological implications here have given you a real warped perspective on how to handle this.
There's theology. There's also, and this is to bring it all the way back to that first thing we talked about with the emerging culture war between progressives and, historic or traditional Christians. There, with the Ravi story, there's this idea that like he's a warrior. There's a lot of these YouTube clips like Ravi destroys atheist on the problem of evil or whatever. And it's really
he's the Ben
reminiscent
Shapiro of the Christian world,
or Jordan Peterson or whatever. And my buddy Matt Carter, who co-hosts the Bad Christian podcast, when they interviewed the Christianity Today reporter, Daniel Silliman, who wrote the big piece on Ravi and was investigating it for a couple of years. And Matt made this point that it reminded him of the Old Testament and how the Israelites wanted a king. And God's like, you don't need a king. You got me. A direct rule by God. And they go, no, we want one. He's like, all right, suit yourselves. And then, calamity ensues. And there's maybe a very deep psychological truth in that narrative that we want a champion. We want someone like Trump, as long as he's close enough to ourselves to fight for us and fight dirty. And we actually don't prefer the way of Jesus, the way of nonviolent resistance. And so that, if that's true, obviously Ravi Zacharias was a millionaire superstar apologist, but if that's what we want in a local preacher too, then that's what we're going to get, because at least in most Western countries, it's a little different in Europe. There are state churches. And so it's slightly different, but in the States, we have a pure market for religion. We have a pure sort of capitalist market. No one is sort of forcing you to be Church of England, right? It's like you will go to the place that you like. You'll go to the church you like that gives you the best product. And there are pluses and minuses to that. But one of the minuses is that the consumers drive the product a lot, and the denominational safeguards and whatever drive it less. And so, if that's what American Christian consumers want, is they want a warrior, they want a king in the way that his Israelites did, well, then that's what we're going to get. And we're going to get all the consequences that come with that. And I think there's something there. I just started thinking about this because that episode's only a couple weeks old. It's been kicking around though. I think there's really something to that. That's
really interesting. And the parallels in that, you look at how helpful and how healthy something like capitalism has been for the West and for individual growth and development. And yet as it develops, as its extremes start to pan out and flesh out, and as it gets to that kind of late stage capitalism, you start to go, ooh, this is not potentially the best model. And maybe it was helpful for some season, but we need to kind of figure out how we kind of course correct or jump ship a little bit or whatever. It feels like, this model for Christianity might have been one of the most incredible models. I mean, it certainly has served America a lot better than the model of church has served Europe, for example. Now, historically, church worked really well, but there's a lot of dynamics. Right? No, sure. But allowing church to be kind of unfettered, allowing church to go, well, we'll be what you want, spiritual definitely results in less people going, well, I'll go somewhere else. Whereas if the church is kind of more fixed in what it's allowed to be and maybe a bit more regulated. Yeah,
I guess I'm not clear though. I don't know about the causation there, because we didn't have either of the world wars on our land. I think that's a big part of the secularization of Europe. The critical theory and all of the kind of Enlightenment stuff did not develop here. So it's hard for me to know. I think it's hard for anybody to know, like, what the real causes are of that differential between Europe and America. Sure. It is possible that having a more entrepreneurial, more, what's the libertarian kind of approach to religion, similarly to the way that encourages, people to invent Apple, maybe there's something like that. I'm not sure. That's really interesting, but I'm not convinced of that.
No, and certainly not either. I'm just saying the
It's
first
possible.
thing that fires in my head is going, gosh, that's interesting. Not necessarily in the success. I think there's maybe some ground maybe there to be fleshed out, but it's really interesting to me to go, what happens when you let church become so unfettered that it caters for people, so it caters. You do end up with that kind of late stage. It may be early on that's not so big a problem when you're dealing with a community.
Evangelicalism.
Late stage evangelicalism. There you go. Gosh, evangelical's so new. Are we even late? It's like it's such a brand new idea anyway. But like when you've got small churches all over the place, popping up all throughout America, and there's 20, 30, 40 people. Again, this is maybe a parallel to Europe as well. Most of our churches are very small. A big church in Europe is 100 people, 200 people. It's a mega church if you get to 200 people. In America, that's like, it's kind of a small mom and pop church, 200 people you got there.
It's medium, And
so the degree of abuse, the separation of pastor from member, it becomes so broad, so wide, very quickly in the American model. That's got to be a big.
That's got to be a big dynamic. Yeah,
you would think so, right?
There's just more. Yeah. It's so interesting. Gosh, there's a lot there. I had another thought, but it doesn't matter. There's too many. There are too many thoughts. Yeah,
there are many thoughts. We'll have you back on it sometime. We can shoot the shit a bit more, and especially now we've gone over your journey, we can just talk random stuff because that was fun. I enjoyed it a lot. And we can maybe talk more about once you start fleshed out. You're fleshing out your paper. We can maybe talk about how that's going. We should talk about
the results,
and we should talk about research anyway, because I feel like we could potentially help each other out here, and I'll connect you with some other people as well.
We should be coordinating.
Yeah, for sure. No, Dan, I have loved chatting. Honestly, this has been such a joy. I like I said, I've only managed to listen to a couple of your episodes and I've loved them, but I don't think I was ready to click just as well as we have. I think we're very similar in a lot of ways.
Cool. So, that's awesome, man. That makes me feel really
it's
good.
Been really fun. It's been really, really fun. Thank you for taking the time and I know you're a busy guy. You're much busier than me. So I appreciate it big time.
I think similar hours, just it's split into more tasks, I really like having many plates in the air. I thrive that way. So I don't, my wife would tell you, don't cry too many tears for me. It's not like I'm working on the laying rail track, I'm doing stuff that I like.
That's true. Well, I like lots of plates in the air. I just can't catch many. Because I do focus. I focus on one. That's exciting. Chuck it up and then just forget I've thrown it up in the air.
Right.
I'm not so good at that, but no, that's great. Dan, you've got your podcast, you have permission.
Permission.
We'll put links to that, but people can find that just searching, I'm presuming, your name, or you have permission. What else? How else can people connect with you, follow what you're doing? Are you on social media and stuff?
Yeah, I am. So you can check out soyou'redeconstructing.com as well. If that sounds like you, or often it's like you have a friend that sounds like they could use that, who is earlier on in the process. And then
to recap, that's kind of like how to explore the different options, kind of if you want to kind of navigate somewhat holding on to Jesus and Christianity in this process, because there's a lot of people that kind of fall into that bracket, right?
Of course there are people who end up outside of the faith, but it's designed for people who are early on in their deconstruction journey, to give them resources, including there's resources about therapy, about churches and other digital communities, about prayer and spiritual practices, and then the meat of the site is all these topics. So there's like 20 topics that each have 20 resources or something like that. That I feel like, I'm really wondering about LGBTQ inclusion. Well, here are a bunch of blog posts, podcast episodes, books, whatever, videos, transcripts, stuff like that for awesome. Just those burning questions that, as you and I know from our own experience, one or more of those questions is often keeping you up at night when you're in the thick of that. And so that's pretty much what it is.
If you're lucky, one or two, usually you've got 30, 40 questions just completely ruining you at night.
I found that I would sort of skip around, though. I would be one or two at a time that really had my
You managed to hone
attention.
in.
Yeah. And then I'm on Twitter and Instagram, and I'll send you links to that if people want to follow me there.
Perfect. We'll make sure the links to those are in the show notes and stuff.
Cool, dude.
But Dan, this has been a real pleasure. We'll stay in touch for sure.
I really enjoyed it. But,
I don't know when this will be out. I'm filming like 7 interviews this week, and they're all kind of a bit up in the air as far as where they're going to come. I used to do 2 a week, and now I'm on 1 a week right now. And So I might transition back into 2 a week because it looks like I'm going to get on top of it again. So, but
Yeah,
I'll shoot
I'm
you a
like-
message when it comes out, and let you
That's
know,
great. I'm
and
like
I'll get
10
a
weeks
headshot
ahead.
from you or something. Oh, dude, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Are
So
you 2 a
I'm-
week, 1 a week? You put
One
out
a
a
week.
lot.
Yeah, 1 a week plus 2 a month.
You do some for Patreon, right? So how can people support you on Patreon? How do they find you? Is that you have permission, or is it Dan Koch?
Yeah, that's patreon.com/Dan Koch.
Okay,
Or
and
you
that's
can go to
Koch.
Koch. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can put that link
Perfect.
there if you want. I'm not trying to crimp your patrons though, Phil.
Are you
know,
kidding me, dude? Come on, like what's your minimum buy-in for Patreon? Like $5?
$5, yeah.
Yeah, people can give me $5 and they give you $5. I have
Actually,
full faith in it.
you have a sliding scale if you can't afford $5.
Even better, right? Give me $9 and give Dan one.
That's fine with me.
No,
Yeah.
I'm all about supporting amazing people and what they're doing and communities, and yeah, if we can finance you so you can give more time to your research and more time to other stuff and whatever, find a more healthy balance. I know that can be a big part of that, figuring out the dynamics.
For me,
so,
it's like I have a good job now, and when I'm a psychologist with a doctorate, I'll have a good job then. It's more about, I find that especially the Facebook group is so much better once I charged for it.
As soon as there's a paywall for something, 100%.
When I did Depolarize, I had a free group, and it just descended. People are. It's not like the people are bad. It's just it just became unhelpful very quickly.
Yeah.
And the Facebook group is easily the best thing about the Patreon community and the whole experience, including my experience of it. It's so awesome. And the paywall is a big part. I bet you've experienced something similar.
100%. My favorite thing all week, every week, is chatting with the different patrons we have on. We use Discord, which is just amazing as well. But I'm not using Facebook anymore. I was pulling my hair out. It's just too much. It was too much of a stress factor and anxiety inducing environment for me. So I
basically only use it for the group. So it's
right.
I occasionally will post, like maybe every month or two, I'll post something else. So yeah, there's not I worry about how many people I'd lose if we switch to Discord, people who are not familiar with it. It's just it's
a bit of a steep curve, and it's a different platform, and absolutely.
Yeah,
so I mean, if you're listening or watching this, you're clicking with what Dan's saying, and you want to be a part of an online community that's a bit more protected, safe, a bit more kind of tight than maybe some larger just generalized groups on Facebook, you should definitely check out his Patreon. And is that mostly progressive Christians that fall into that kind of, would you say?
I would say the average listener is a progressive Christian, but we have quite a few agnostics and atheists, and we have a handful of people who would identify as at least sort of moderate theologically or center right. I don't think there's probably nobody would like me if they really identify as conservative. I just would not be a good place for them. But there's some, there's like some Republican voting, probably not a lot of Trump voters, although maybe a handful. But mostly it's progressive Christians or people who are kind of spiritual in some sense, and a handful of non-spiritual people.
Right. You don't have like John MacArthur using his alt account in there, no?
No, and I don't have. And there's no trolls. We are completely troll free.
That's the paywall, right? I mean, even just $1 a month, and it's like, sorry, I'm just not willing to troll you for that. Right?
Yep. People are not willing to pay to
barrier
troll.
about paying someone that you do not like. You do not like what they're about. I'm not giving you $1 or $5 a month. No way.
Yeah, no way.
Even if it means I can go in there and save people, I am not giving you $5. And it's like, awesome, perfect. I found my barrier.
That's so funny. Yeah, I haven't even thought of it that
isn't
way.
It? There's some psychological barrier that
I don't even get a lot of like emails or tweets or any, like, I feel like I'm not even getting really any pushback, and it's like the show has grown quite a bit and I'm still not getting it. Like, at first I thought it was like, well, maybe not enough people listen, but now that doesn't seem like that could be the reason. It's got to be something more like people are just content in their own bubbles. And they're not even, I understand, like, if I get a hit piece about me in Gospel Coalition, I'm sure I'll get a ton of hate mail. Like, there's a certain level of profile, but like a lot of people listen and I don't get any pushback really.
Yeah.
I mean, I get pushback from like my wife and my friends. I don't just have people stroking my ego all day long, but I just mean, like, I'm not getting those like, you're sending people to hell, all caps,
Right.
Facebook messages. I'm just not getting them.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think,
interesting.
just to stroke your ego a bit more, I do think there's a lot about that is that you have a very soft, generous, compassionate approach when we talk about these things. And so it's really easy to talk about kind of progressive topics and open up a topic about, here's the different ways we can look at LGBTQ or whatever it might be. But I think that the way you would approach that topic, even if I was radically polarized from maybe where you have landed, I think the way that you approach something like that is so kind, so generous, so compassionate, that it's quite hard to hate someone like that. I might hate their position and get a bit frustrated,
Right.
but I'm probably less likely to send them a death threat. I'm not going to cut up a newspaper over it. I'm good.
Right.
And so I do think as part of your approach,
that could be part of it.
I can imagine, my friends Adrian and Josh over at Dirty Rotten Church Kids, I can imagine Christians getting more upset over their podcast than yours, just because of
definitely.
the dynamics of how that conversation flows. And I love their stuff, and I think it's really important that they're doing what they do the way they do it.
I like those guys, yeah.
It creates a different audience, but I do think certainly they're not going to have many moderate right people kind of like exploring where they're at. And so I do think there's something about just the way that you approach that. And in some ways, maybe that is, I know that's your heart to convert people, but if there was a way to reach people in that place and give them space to explore and maybe grow as maybe you or I might understand that, that's probably the way to do it.
Right? I mean, I did a show called Depolarize a few years back, and I just became so convinced by the psychology of it all that we're just so much more tribal than we think we are, and what that should produce in us is a huge dose of humility. Not like sounding humble, but like actual humility, like I think this, but here's why I could be wrong. And so I think also because I don't really produce anything short, I don't have YouTube clips, I don't have a lot of
no sound bites to get you on.
There's no I don't even do short clips on.
I'll make a great soundbite from this that says you're a Satanist or something. I might have to dub you a bit, get a voice coach in or something.
But so the barrier to entry to trolling me is listening to a 90-minute episode, and no one's going to spend 90 minutes just to figure out they don't like somebody. So that might be protecting me a little bit as well.
For sure. That's maybe one of the things that helps me, although I definitely get a lot of people that don't like what I do. So who knows? I'm probably just a little bit less well-rounded.
You also probably have a bigger reach and stuff. So
I would doubt it. I piss off everyone. I piss off the progressives. I piss off the liberals. I piss off the conservatives. I'm pretty good at pissing everyone off.
You should piss off left and right. I think in 2021, if you don't make people on either side at least a little bit mad, you're doing it wrong, because we're just all siloed way too much. I wish we had a parliamentary system like
Did you see the study that got posted about that called, I think it was Perception Gap? Such an interesting study. I'll need to send you it. I think it's people listening to this still. I don't know. I mean, I'll probably keep this. Perceptiongap.us. Really fascinating, where they basically asked Republicans and Democrats to self-identify where they're at, and then to basically label where they're at on different things, and then ask them where are Republicans on this, and left up. And then they basically looked at the different perception gaps of these different things, and it was astonishing to see just how big those perception gaps were. So many of them agreed on basically everything, or were 5 percentage points different on their position. And yet the perception gaps were 70% across, when it was actually only 5 or 8 or something like that. And you're like, oh my gosh.
That might have been Ryan Burge's work. He's a religion-focused data guy. And his episode with me is airing pretty soon. And we got into a bunch of that stuff. Yeah.
Nice. Dude, I need to just troll through all your podcasts to find all these great people to interview. I mean, I think we've probably done about the same sort of amount, so we can easily double just by swapping people that we know.
Look at that. Well, thanks for having me, man.
Let's stop raffling, because I know you've got family. Your kid's definitely up from his nap now. And,
he's up now, yeah.
Yeah. All right, Dan, really, I appreciate it. And people check out Dan's stuff for sure. And
thanks,
we'll stay in touch.
Appreciate it, man.
All right. Love you, man. Catch you later.
Peace.
If you are deconstructing, there is no reason to do this alone. It can be an incredibly lonely process, but the deconstructionnetwork.com is a free resource to help you find others deconstructing in your local area. If you would like to support what I do, everything I do is for free, from talking to people for hours on end to producing resources and podcasts. It is only possible because people give generously. There's never any need to give. It will always be free, everything I do. But if you do, we do have an amazing private community group that we talk on over on Discord that you would gain access to. And we do regular audio and video chats on there as well. So it'd be great to see you in there. But of course, never any requirement. And of course, please, please, please come and talk to me on Instagram. I love connecting with people. I love helping people on their journey. If you need a safe space to process your deconstruction, I would love to connect. It's just at Phil Drysdale. Love every one of you. Peace.